Jacques Brel was 24 years old when he watched Edith Piaf perform in a small Paris theater in 1953. He told people about it for the rest of his life, but he never described exactly what he had seen. He was, at 24, not yet the figure he would become. He had arrived in Paris from Belgium a few years earlier, carrying with him an ambition that was not modest, and a talent that had not yet found the form it needed to become what it would be. He had been performing, in small venues, in the working-class entertainment circuit that offered opportunities to performers who had not yet established themselves in the more prestigious Paris Chanson world. And he had been writing, producing songs with the particular moral and emotional intensity that would eventually define his work, but that in 1953 was still in the process of developing its final shape. Paris in 1953 was, for a young Belgian performer trying to establish himself in the chanson world, a city with very specific rules about who was allowed to matter and when. Brel was persistent. He was in the rooms. But the rooms he was in were still the rooms available to someone who had not yet been decided upon. And what was available in those rooms was not always what he needed. He watched all of them carefully, because that was how he was going to learn what was possible, and he had not yet seen the thing that would show him the answer to the question he was carrying. To understand what the evening meant to him, what seeing Piaf on that stage in 1953 did to his understanding of what he was trying to do, you have to understand the specific conditions of his artistic formation in those years. Brel came from a world that was different from Piaf's in almost every measurable respect. He came from Belgium, from a bourgeois family that had expected him to follow the family business, from a background that had given him a moral seriousness that was not always comfortable in the world it found itself in. He had not come to music through the Paris streets. He had come to it through the recognition at some point in his young adulthood that the thing he was going to do with his life was perform, and that performing was the only form of self-expression that felt commensurate with what he needed to express. The accounts of what he said about it in the years after 1953 are consistent in their assessment of its effect and vague about its content, which is precisely the quality that Brel's own descriptions of the evening had. He described it as the night he understood. He did not, by the various accounts of the people who heard him describe it, elaborate on what specifically he had understood, because what he had understood was not the kind of thing that elaboration improves. He had understood, from watching, the level at which it was possible to perform, the level at which the performance and the performer were no longer distinguishable, where the commitment to the material had become complete enough that there was no person managing the performance and the performance happening, but only the performance happening. This understanding did not make him into Piaf. He was not trying to become Piaf. The music he would make in the years after 1953 was his own in every respect. Its themes, its moral intensity, its particular way of confronting the audience with things the audience would have preferred not to think about. Nothing in it was borrowed from her, but the level at which he made it, the degree of commitment he brought to every performance, the standard he held himself to in every room he stood in, was informed by what he had seen in that small Paris theater in the year he was 24. He had seen someone perform at the absolute limit of what was possible. He had watched, and he had understood. And for the rest of his career, which lasted until a heart condition forced him off the stage, and which produced some of the most celebrated recordings in the history of French chanson, the thing he was reaching toward in every performance was the thing he had seen in that room. In later years, he occasionally mentioned the 1953 evening in interviews. In the oblique way he sometimes mentioned things that had been formative without having been dramatic. He mentioned it as an evening that had shown him something. He did not say what. The people who interviewed him understood, from the way he said it and from what they knew of his work, that what he had been shown was not something that required description. It was something that was visible, if you were paying attention, in every performance he had given since. What Brel was looking for in the Paris of 1953 was the thing that he had not yet seen done in the way he believed it could be done. The thing he knew, in the abstract, was possible, but that he had not yet encountered in a form that made the abstract concrete. He had seen performers, he had watched chanson singers of various levels of accomplishment and reputation. He had formed opinions about what was working and what was not, but he had not yet seen the thing that would show him where the limit actually was, how far a performer could take a song before the song broke, how much of themselves a person could give to a stage before the stage gave it back to the audience. He saw it at the small Paris theater in 1953. He was in the audience. He had a seat. He had come, presumably, with the same combination of curiosity and professional interest that young performers in any era bring to the performances of the people who are ahead of them in the career they are trying to build. He was not there as a fan, exactly, or not only as a fan. He was there as someone who is trying to learn something, in the way that all of us try to learn the things we cannot yet articulate, by finding someone who already knows them and paying close attention. The theater was not one of the major venues. It was not the Olympia, not one of the prestigious addresses that the Paris Chanson world organized its hierarchies around. It was a mid-level house of the kind that significant performers used when the timing was right. Intimate enough to be something different from the large hall experience. Important enough that the audience that gathered for it had come specifically, with specific expectations. What Brel saw from his seat was Piaf at the microphone, doing the thing she did. This is not a description that sounds specific enough to be the description of a life-changing event, but it is the most accurate version available. Because what made the evening what it was for him was not any single song, any single moment, any specific gesture or phrase or note. What made it what it was the totality. The experience of watching a performer who was, in every moment of the performance, entirely present in what she was doing. Entirely committed. Not executing a performance, but living inside one, from the first song to the last, without any visible reserve of self-protection or any distance between the performer and the material. He had not seen this before, or he had not seen it at this level, with this degree of consistency across an entire evening, in a room small enough that there was nowhere to be anything other than fully visible. He had watched Edith Piaf perform in 1953. He had been 24 years old and unknown, and still in the process of becoming what he would become. The career that followed, the recordings that are still played, the performances that people who saw them have described as among the most intense they witnessed in a lifetime of attending concerts. The songs that entered the permanent vocabulary of French-language music, was built on the work of a person who had set himself a standard in a small Paris theater in 1953 and had spent every subsequent year trying to meet it. The theater in Paris, where he had seen her in 1953, was not a landmark. It was one of many rooms in the city that had, over the years, held the performances that shaped the people who attended them without leaving any record of having done so. It was the kind of room that does its work invisibly, that gives its audiences what they came for and then releases them back into the city, carrying whatever they took from the evening into lives that will not be documented in any way that connects the evening to its effects. Brel had walked out of that room carrying something that would take years to fully manifest in his work and decades to be named by the people who would eventually write about him. He had walked out, 24, unknown, with no public evidence yet of what he was going to become. He had been one person in a room full of people watching Edith Piaf perform, anonymous, unrecorded, present for the same reasons everyone else was present. Edith Piaf did not know he was there. She did not know, in 1953, that the young Belgian performer in the audience that night would go on to become one of the most significant figures in the chanson tradition she was at the center of. She was simply doing what she did, on the stage she was on, for the audience she had been given. The giving was complete. It always was. And somewhere in the audience, a 24-year-old understood, for the first time and permanently, what complete meant. She had shown him what everything looked like. He had spent the rest of his life trying to give it.